Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 6-game college basketball slate. We also have a 2-game NBA slate, so I'm going to look at the NBA slate at the end of the video. Before I get started, though, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Hopefully everybody's doing well. We actually cashed in the NBA pretty good yesterday, and we cashed in college basketball last night. But hopefully this is going to be a pretty good slate. There's a lot of good plays on this slate for college basketball, too. If we look at the games, I'm going to go through each one individually, but if we look at the games, there's not a ton of injuries that are really going to affect us fantasy-wise. But we do have some high-scoring games and a couple lower-scoring games, so I'll go through that as I get through each game. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to start with the Penn State-Michigan State game here, and we have several options in this game to have some fantasy uh, opportunities. This game does feature a 146-point total, which is actually one of the lower on the slate. Uh, one of the three under 150. Looking at this game, Michigan State's also favored by 13 points, which is the biggest spread on the slate. So do keep that in mind. And for injury situations, Penn State's Kern Jr. is questionable, and for Michigan State, Fears and Kohler are out, but both those guys have not played much anyway. None of those guys, for that matter, have played that much. So for Michigan State, though, we do have three guys that I really do like today. Tyson Walker is one. I do think his range is a little bit lower than I'd like it to be at his price point, but he's had some really solid games. And with this game being somewhat of a 10-point or 13-point spread, I think he's going to have plenty of opportunity, but I don't think it'll get out of hand too early where he plays less minutes. And even if he only, if he can get 27, 28 fantasy points, you wouldn't love it, but it wouldn't be the worst thing ever, as he just needs 32 to 5x or to 4x here. Looking at Hoggard, now he's a guy that I really like today. He's been playing extremely well lately. He has a nice floor and a high ceiling here, as I think he's going to get in the 25 to 35 range. Today he needs just around 26 to 28 fantasy points, so he is somewhat of a core play for me today, and so I do like him quite a bit. I think he's probably one of my favorite plays on the slate. But we can also look at, as a value play, a risky value play, we can look at Mady Sissoko. He has played pretty good recently, though his minutes are somewhat inconsistent. He does start, but he definitely doesn't get a lot of usage, and that is a concern because he has a pretty low floor as a result. But he's still a value play on the slate, especially with not a super ton of value. There's some around, but he's one of the cheaper options that has some viability today. With the blowout potential, or at least the comfortable game potential here, he definitely has some usage as well. But he definitely carries a decent amount of risk. Looking at Penn State, we actually have some guys I really like today as well. Ace Baldwin is one of them. Now, Penn State has been pretty solid when it comes to win-loss this season, and he's been pretty good in all the games. I don't expect him to have an off game here. I think that he'll have a good game regardless of how the outcome of the game goes. And so that does give him some potential. I have him in the 25 to 35 range. Keep in mind he does need to get around 28 to 30 fantasy points to pay off here. So he just needs a little bit more than what I think his floor is for this game. Looking at Dunn for them as well, he's another kind of value play that comes off the bench that has some utility here. He's been pretty good the last few games, but he definitely carries some risk as he has had some inconsistencies throughout the season. But I like how he's played lately as he's been the starter. So, uh, or sorry, he's uh, Puff Johnson, excuse me, is the starter and hasn't been playing particularly well, and Dunn has made it a mission to play well during that stretch. So we'll have to wait and see with him, but he definitely looks like an opportunity, having a good, decent opportunity for this game. Looking at Michigan and Minnesota, this game does feature a lowest total on the slate, 130. I'm sorry. This game features one of the highest totals on the slate, 151 points. Michigan is also favored by 6.5 points. We don't have too many injuries here that really have anything to do with anything, so it's definitely a game to look at from a fantasy perspective. One of my favorite plays from Michigan, who is favored to win the game, is Nakamoa. He's one of the more expensive plays on the slate, but he's been very steady throughout the season. He really doesn't have a super low floor. Right now, I think a 28 to 40 fantasy point game is in order at $7,600. He needs around 30 fantasy points to pay off, so he's definitely a decent option on the slate. And he's at a position that's a little bit harder to roster today at forward, so excuse me, he's definitely worth a look. Excuse me. As for Minnesota, I like Mike Mitchell Jr. quite a bit today. This game should be pretty tight and scoring a lot. Mitchell has played well throughout the season, and he's really got a little bit just too cheap for what his potential is here. I think he's going to get somewhere between 25 and 35 fantasy points, and he really just needs that 25 points to pay off here. So he's in a great spot and has a good opportunity to have a good game. I also do like Cam Christie, though he does carry some risk today. He's a little bit pricey than I like, but he's playing a lot of minutes. Excuse me, and he had some good potential in this one, especially since he started the last few games. He's really uh, become pretty consistent in those games. His usage is not, as good as some of the other players, but he's definitely a decent option and a pretty good price range. I think his range today is 18 to 30. He's just he's a good contrarian if you want to switch from Mitchell, or if you just want to stack a couple of Minnesota players. This is definitely a way to do it. Excuse me. Looking at Wichita State, North Texas, this is actually the lowest scoring game on the slate. Now, this does still lead to having a couple decent options, but it's definitely going to carry some risk as the total here is quite a bit lower than the other games. In fact, it's over 15 points lower than any other game, but it is a tight game. It's the only game that has a 1 point spread in Wichita State's favor. If I look at Wichita State, I felt like most of the guys are a little bit overpriced here, but Poto does have some potential, though he does have a low floor, so to keep that in mind, I think a 16 to 25 point range is in play. 25 obviously isn't great for his price because he needs 24 fantasy points to pay off, but he definitely has some potential today. He's a little bit risky though. Looking at North Texas, I do find a lot more options that I like here. This is a team that you could technically do some stacking with, but my favorite plays here are Reuben Jones, who's just priced under what he's been doing throughout the season, and at $6,300, he does need 23, 24 fantasy points. And he does have a little bit lower floor. I think somewhere in the 21 to 22 is what his floor is today. But he also doesn't have the super high ceiling. It's pretty much stuck at around 25, 26. So I think he's probably in line to have a solid game and be a good play. But he doesn't have a ton of upside where you can be like, all right, that guy could win me the slate, but he could keep you from losing it. So that's kind of what I look for him. Jason Edwards also interesting today, as his price is a little bit cheaper even, but he actually has a bit of a wider range in the 17 to 25 range, but he's a little bit cheaper and gives you a little bit more leverage from other positions. However, I do think both those guys have some utility today and are worthwhile to take a look at. Looking at Washington and Oregon, this is another game that has a big total, 153 points. This is actually the second highest total on the slate, and Washington is favored to win the game by 4 points. That is somewhat surprising today. I thought Oregon would probably be favored in this one, but it's close enough that it probably doesn't matter too much. It doesn't really affect the fantasy potential for the two teams. But if we look at Washington and Oregon, really Washington is the only team that has some fantasy potential today, as I felt like Oregon's players are just overpriced, even though they have the easier defensive matchup technically. I felt like that they were just been priced up quite a bit. But if we look at Keon Brooks Jr., now he definitely carries some risk as he does have a low floor at times. He's played pretty well recently, and he has a good upside game here. Him and Samir Wheeler are the two guys that have the most usage for this team by a lot, and you could definitely stack both of them, but you do have to keep in mind that they do have lower floors than other players in their price ranges, but they also have higher ceilings because they are the usage dominated players. Even if they were to get beat, a lot of times they get plenty of potential here. See, I also want to look at Severe Wheeler here. I do like him quite a bit today. He's had a couple off games though, so to keep that in mind. But even his low games, he typically does some things, and so his range is pretty extreme with the 20 to 22 to 40 fantasy point range. But I do like Wheeler decently well today, as he has a good matchup here against Oregon. The other guy I like some is Corrine Johnson. For them, he's played pretty well, though he does, much like the other guys on this team, he has a low floor. I think his range is really extreme today at 12 to 30 range. That said, if he has a decent game and he plays over 20 minutes, he definitely has the potential to have a solid game here. But he definitely carries a little bit of risk, just like Washington seems to always carry some risk. But they definitely have some potential today. But Oregon, again, like I said, pretty much avoidable. Looking at Colorado and Arizona, this game does feature a lot of players that I like, and this is also the highest scoring game on the slate, 161 point total. So it's not too shocking that this game does feature some guys that have some utility here. We also have two injuries for this game again for Colorado that definitely could come into play. Hammond will start for Williams, as Williams is out, and then O'Brien would start if Smith gets ruled out. So we do have to keep in mind to see if that's sorry, if De Silva, excuse me, is ruled out. De Silva is currently questionable. He hasn't played in a few games, but in those games, O'Brien has started and he has played pretty well. So Let's look at the guys that we do like for Arizona first. I have this is definitely a game you could stack up, but Caleb Love looks like a great option on this slate. I think this game's gonna be tight, even though it does have a 12-point spread for Arizona. They have had some rough games against teams in the same level as Colorado, so I think it's gonna be a tighter game than maybe it looks. But I still expect the top players for Arizona to play well, as they have played pretty well. Caleb has played good throughout the season. I think his range here today for this game is 30 to 40, which is slightly lower than I'd like considering his price point, but he definitely has that positive range here. He had a rare off game against Alabama a few games ago, but if you look through his entire season, he's really played well most of the year, so he looks like a great option on the slate. Looking at Bello for them as well, he's a little pricey. And he does have a lower floor than we'd like at just 22, 23 fantasy points. But he also has a pretty good ceiling, and he has played well. In this type of game, as long as they don't get blasted like they did against Stanford, he should be fine and have some really good potential to have a solid game. Not only that, but this game is at home, so that definitely helps as well. Looking at Larson for them, he's a guy that tends to be kind of streaky, but he's played decently well. His floor is around 20 fantasy points today. I wish he would get a little bit higher than that, but I wish his price was a little bit cheaper, I should say, right around 6,000. But he's still a decent play, as he has a pretty good ceiling, and with this game being at home and having some potential to be pretty closer in their favor, he has some upside. KJ Lewis is kind of a risky play today, though, because he will get a little bit more usage if the game gets a little bit out of hand. Uh, as you can see through the games he's played, his fantasy points have been better, mostly in games that have been a little bit high scoring, and this definitely has a high scoring possibility, so he's definitely worth a look. But he does carry some risk. He's not a must play by any stretch of imagination. I wish he was a little bit cheaper as well. Looking at Colorado, I really actually like several players from this game, from this team, especially if De Silva is ruled out. But KJ Simpson is the top play on the slate, and that, or one of the most expensive plays for that matter. He's been very good throughout the season. Now, I'm going to preface to show that Colorado's only actually lost 2 games. And even in those 2 games where they lost, he played very well. And so I don't necessarily think he's going to have a bad game here. His floor is right around 30 fantasy points on the season. And at $9,000, he does need to score about 35, 36 fantasy points to pay off here. But he's done very well throughout the year. And I don't expect him to have a bad game here. He's their best player, and he's definitely been dominating, trying to showcase that. Looking at Hadley for them, he definitely carries some risk today, especially if they were to get behind early. But he's played well throughout the season. He does have a lower floor than his price at his price point that I'd like it to be, but he does have a good ceiling, and I think his range is 19 to 27 points today. He definitely carries some risk today, and if De Silva were to play, I would kind of avoid most of the other Colorado players outside of KJ Simpson. Looking at Luke O'Brien, he's a guy that would play more minutes if uh, De Silva is out. Excuse me, sorry about that. But he would be in play if that's the case. Though in the about 6 starts that he's had this season, and 5 of them he's been over 20 fantasy points. He had a rare wonky game against in the last game where he only scored 9.5 fantasy points, but he didn't get a lot of usage in that one. I think this is the type of game that he would have a lot of potential in, assuming that De Silva misses. But we'll have to wait and see if De Silva does play or not. It looks like he might be back, so it's hard to say. And then Hammond is somebody that's in play with the other guys out for Colorado. He's been getting more usage now. He definitely carries some risk at his price point. I wish he was around 45 to 55,000 price as opposed to the 5,100. But he has a pretty good range at 15 to 24, so he's definitely worth a look here, though he does carry a little bit of risk. Looking at the last game, we have Arizona State and Utah. Now, this game does feature a lower total and a somewhat of a okay spread. Utah's favored to win the game by 6 points, but it only has a 146-point total, which is second lowest on the slate. But that said, we still have a couple guys that I do like. Looking at Arizona State first, they aren't favored to win the game, but Adam Miller has played well in his first few games back from his injuries, and it looks like, or I should say, from being eligible, he finally got ruled back in, and in 3 of the 4 games, he's been over 20 fantasy points. If he can get at least to 20 fantasy points, he can definitely pay off here, and he's nice and cheap, which definitely helps, and so he's definitely worth a look. Looking at Utah, though, Gabe Madsen, is a good mid-range play today. He's played very well throughout the season. His range is 22 to 30 fantasy points, and he's not overpriced at $6,500. He does need 26 fantasy points to pay off, but he's played very well lately too. And with them being slightly favored to win, I think that gives him a lot of utility here. I also like Devion Smith. Now he does carry some more risk. He's only played a couple of games so far, as he's one of the guys that has also been recently ruled eligible, and his minutes have been not very consistent yet. But if he can get over 18 fantasy points, then that definitely gives him some potential. He does need to get over 20 to pay off for us, but I think that's definitely capable, as he's looking like his minutes are going to increase and his usage is going to increase as well. So, both those guys for Utah definitely have some utility. I think this slate is pretty rough, but interesting, I should say, but it does have some rough edges, and there's not a ton of value, but there's enough value. I think we can make a decent lineup, so it's definitely interesting slate. Let's look over at the NBA here. This slate features only 2 games, and that is Milwaukee, San Antonio Spurs, and then Denver Golden State Warriors. This game is going to be kind of hard. Slate is going to be somewhat hard to do some fantasy aspects from, because it feels like the value plays have been ramped up a little bit in their cost. Obviously, Milwaukee has a couple in Connaughton and Beasley, especially if Middleton is to miss today. For the Spurs, they're actually got some pretty decent options with some of their mid-range players, especially with Collins and Branham likely out. I expect those to have some utility here. I think Denver has some potential as well, as they have obviously the best matchup here against the Warriors. I think Joker and Murray and Porter and Gordon all have some utility here. Though it looks like they're going to be mostly at full strength. Jackson is probable. I expect them to be at full strength, and their top 3 or 4 guys are going to be the guys where you're going to have to look for fancy output. As for the Warriors, they're pretty avoidable today in this matchup, and Trace Jackson Davis, who's been a very good play recently, his price has come up quite a bit, which kind of makes him hard to roster as well. So overall, I think this is probably a pretty avoidable slate with just the 2 games, but it's going to be hard because there's not a lot of value play, and obviously we need to, we're going to have some value mixed in there, and we're going to have to try to find that with the Spurs Milwaukee game most likely, and then maybe a couple guys from Denver. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.